Hello again, and welcome to the session on Theatre of the Absurd. Theatre of the Absurd is a term which is applied to a number of works in drama and prose fiction, and which have in common the sense that human condition is essentially absurd, and that this condition can be adequately represented only in the works of literature that are themselves absurd. So, both the mood and dramaturgy of absurdity, although they were anticipated as early as 1896, because in 1896 we have Alfred Jarry's French play titled Ubu Roy, that is Ubu the King, and it popularized the kind of absurdity. But the literature of absurdism or absurdity has its roots, sometimes also in the movements of expressionism and surrealism. We have talked about these two movements in our earlier sessions. And also in fiction, which is written around 1920s, especially when we talk of Frank Kafka and his works like The Trial and the Metamorphosis. We see that it has the roots of absurdism. But when we look at the history of the theatre of the absurd, we see that this movement emerged in France after the horrors of World War II, that is between 1939 and 45, and also as a rebellion against some essential beliefs and values in traditional culture and literature. Now, this tradition included the assumptions that human beings are fairly rational creatures who live in at least partially, say, intelligible universe, and also that they are part of a very ordered social structures, and also that they are capable of heroism and dignity even after defeats. So after the 1940s, we see that there was a widespread tendency, especially prominent among the existential philosophy of popular philosophers like Jean Paul Sartre and Albert Camus. They saw human being as isolated existent who is cast into an alien universe, and they conceive the human world as possessing no truth or value and no meaning. So sometimes it is also a kind of a term which reflects the style of theatre that the plays represented, in which the plays focused largely on the ideas of existentialism, human existence, and expressed what happens when human existence lacks meanings or purpose and there is no communication. Waiting for Godot is the best example of this, where there is no communication and that's completely broken. Because the structure of the play, it is typically a roundabout kind of a structure. The finishing point the same as the starting point, so it goes moves in circles, and there is logical construction and argument are they just give away to some kind of an irrational and illogical speeches, and in which the ultimate conclusion is silence. That is, we can talk about this truly and thoroughly in the context of existential philosophy, because this is how human life is designed, molded, takes shapes, and finally comes to an end through silence. The absurd or the element of absurd in such plays, they take the form of a man's reaction to a different world which has lost its meaning, which is apparently without meaning, and man is considered to be a puppet who is controlled or menaced by some invisible outside forces. Now, this kind of a writing was first popularized by UNESCO play The Bold Soprano. We see that the term has been applied to wide range of plays, sometimes very characteristic of, say, comedy, similar to that of horrific and producing horrific and tragic images in which the characters are caught between some hopeless situations and they are forced to do repetitive or meaningless actions. And their dialogues are full of cliches, wordplay, nonsense. The plots are also cynical, they are absurdly expansive, and they are either written as a dismissal of realism or either as a parody, and they totally discard the concept of a well made play. Now, critic Martin Esslin, he is considered to be the pioneer or who is considered to be the one who coined the term the theater of the absurd in 1960 in his essay, The Theater of the Absurd, which begins with focusing on the playwrights like Samuel Beckett, Arthur Admov, and UNESCO. And Estlin says that their plays, all these writers' plays, have one common denominator, that is the absurd. And this is a word which Estlin defines, a quotation from Anasco himself, where he says that absurd is that which has not purpose or goal or objective. Something which does not have a purpose or a goal or objective is called as absurd. We have one more famous quotation by Albert Camus, which defines the concept of absurd truly. And in the myth of Sisyphus, he says that in a universe that is suddenly deprived of illusions and of light, man feels a stranger. His is an irremediable exile. This divorce between man and his life, the actor and his setting, truly constitutes the feeling of absurdity. That is a kind of a dilemma or a conflict towards understanding his own existence. Man involves himself into a kind of an exile of absurdity which is never ending, and this the feeling of absurdity constitutes and continues in his life. We have one more quotation by Nasco, the French author of Bal Soprano, and he also talks about the concept of the absurd, and he says that cut off from his religious, metaphysical, and transcendental roots, man is lost. So, in the concept of absurd, man is completely lost. All his actions become senseless, absurd, and useless. And he says people drowning in meaninglessness can only be grotesque, and their sufferings can only appear tragic by derision. So, this kind of a meaninglessness, where we don't have meaning in anything, constitutes the dilemma of absurd as well as the concept or the main feature of absurd. Samuel Beckett is considered to be the most eminent and influential writer of this mode, both in drama and in prose fiction. He was an Irishman who lived in Paris and who often wrote in French, and then his works were translated into English. His plays such as Waiting for Godot and Endgame, they project irrationalism. They project helplessness, they project absurdity of life in dramatic forms that reject all realistic settings, all logical reasonings, and all coherently developed plots. Just a brief idea about Waiting for Godot, which presents two tramps in a waste place. We have to go into detail and read because it's very interesting to understand the theater of the absurd. And then reading something about Waiting for Godot. These two tramps, they are lost in a waste place. They fruitlessly and hopelessly wait for an unidentified person, which is named as Godot, who may or may not exist, and with whom they sometimes think they remember that they may have an appointment. And it's very interesting to read one of the dialogue, and he remarks, nothing happens, nobody comes, nobody goes, it's awful. So they don't actually know whether they are waiting for the real person or it's just an imaginative person. And the play is absurd because it is a kind of an say parody of assumptions of the Western culture. And we see that the dialogues are often funny and slapsticks are used. And one more example by Beckett is Melondice and the Unnameable. They also present an anti hero who actually play absurd moves of the end game of civilization, and they tend to undermine the coherence of language. So we can go and read about them in more detail when we want to understand the theater of the absurd or the concept of absurd in the context of Samuel Beckett and Waiting for Godot and his other prose fictions. Another French playwright who is also popular and associated with the concept of absurd is Jean Genet, who is considered to be someone who combined absurdism and diabolism. And it is considered that some of his dramatic works, like they inspired the works of Harold Pinter and Edward Albee, because they are also written in the same mode. We also have a name here, Tom Stoppard, who wrote Rosencrantz and Guildenstern's Are Dead. And the early plays of like Tom Stoppard, he also exploits the device of absurd theater to achieve the comical, to achieve the philosophical ends through comic incidents. And we also drop in here one sentence that the theater of the absurd or plays like this, they have affinities with another movement which is related with black comedy or black humor, because we have inept characters there in a very nightmarish kind of a world play. And sometimes it is also called as tragic farce, where the events are very comic, horrifying, and also absurd. And we have very fine examples of this black comedy and black humor. If we want to know more about them, we can go and read Joseph Heller's Catch 22, very popular work. Thomas Pynchon's Five is again popular. And then we have more names here. So we can also have an idea about wit, humor, and comic when we talk about this theater of the absurd to understand this concept vis-a-vis the concept of existential philosophy and absurdism.